Hello, welcome back. This is part 2 of this week's lecture, and we're going to be talking about protein and their basic unit, amino acids. This first part is going to focus on an overview of protein and talk about amino acids and what the basic structure of protein is like. So just like with carbohydrates, as their individual units are sugar, the individual units of proteins are going to be amino acids. What makes proteins unique is like carbohydrates and fats, they have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but the unique aspect of protein is that they also have nitrogen. Protein plays very important roles in a lot of different biological processes. It serves a role in structural and regulatory functions, and it can serve as an energy source, although it's not a great energy source. It's very inefficient, only used in cases of biological emergencies. Although the basic unit of protein is amino acids, there's many different types of amino acids. It's about 20 different total. 9 of these are essential, 11 are non-essential. And what that means, essential means that it's essential that we get them because our body cannot produce them. And non-essential means that our body is going to produce them by itself. So the 9 essential amino acids, those are the ones we have to consume through our diet because our body does not produce those on its own. What's cool about protein is that the individual amino acids don't have a role and function. It's how they're actually sequenced. So the order of the individual amino acids is what is important. So what's going to happen is we're going to have a certain protein, we're going to eat a protein, we're going to break that down into its individual amino acids, as you can see in the middle of the screen, and then we're going to take those individual amino acids and we're going to reconstruct something in our body, a certain type of protein. And the type of protein that we need to reconstruct, it's going to have a certain sequence of amino acids. So we break it down into individual units, and then we build it up back into complex molecules like it was before. The essential amino acids, and it's not necessary that you know what these are, but the essential amino acids are histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. On that last slide of the 11 non-essential amino acids, there were 3 conditionally essential amino acids, which means that our body requires external ingestion of these in very severe circumstances. So we need certain amino acids, these conditionally essential amino acids, in the case of severe burns, wounds, major injury, or an infection. Just want to check and see if you've been paying attention. What element is found in proteins or amino acids, but not in glucose or carbohydrates and triglycerides or fats? Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus. The answer to that last one was nitrogen. Now in this next section, we're going to break down some of the different functions of protein. The main functions of proteins can be broken down into 3 different categories. Protein plays a role in body structure. It helps to regulate various body processes, and then it also helps to promote immune function and overall health. And then it is an energy source. Not a great one, but it still serves as a source of energy. Protein, first of all, is a component of collagen, which is the main structural component of all tissue and bones in the body. Protein also plays a role in cell structure, and then it's also a main component of body parts. And that includes things like skin, hair, ligaments, tendons, bones, obviously muscles, but also those other things as well. We know that protein is a component of our muscle, and the way that it works is we have our muscles, we exercise them. That exercise is going to cause a certain amount of muscle damage and breakdown, and the areas of the muscle that are damaged or broken down, as long as they're not broken down too much, when we add protein to them, they recover and they compensate a little bit, actually, as long as we get enough protein so that our muscles actually become bigger and we get stronger over time with regular exercise and with adequate amounts of protein. We need both of those things. Large amounts and regular exercise without adequate protein is just going to result in muscle breakdown or muscle stagnation. Um, and then if we eat a lot of protein but don't have the exercise to work the muscles, then the muscles won't grow and that extra protein just turns into body fat. By serving as a main component of the skin, protein helps to ensure that we have a good barrier from bacteria. And then on top of that, protein is responsible for releasing a chemical that when the barrier of skin is broken and oxygen is exposed underneath the skin, it's going to send out something called fibrin that causes the protein to bind to the blood vessels so that they clot. So protein is a component of the skin which serves as a barrier to outside forces, and then it also promotes clotting of the blood once oxygen is exposed to our blood. Proteins also are the main component of antibodies, and these are what protect the body from foreign invaders. Vaccines, these cause a mild release of the protein antibodies to fight against a certain disease. So the problem with something like the coronavirus is that our body does not have a strong enough antibody response to that type of virus. Our body is not used to it, so when it enters our body, it's able to do quite a bit of damage before our body is able to create enough antibodies to fight back against it. So if we were able to get a vaccine to something like the coronavirus, then when it enters us, we would be able to fight it off a lot better. We wouldn't see quite as many negative health reactions as we're seeing right now throughout the world. Protein is also a major component of enzymes, and enzymes are what cause chemical reactions to occur in the body. So we talked about digestion. Digestion is the breakdown of longer nutrients chemically into much shorter ones. So like with carbohydrates, we have a long starch molecule. We want to break that down into individual sugar molecules. We're going to do that through enzymatic activity, enzymes being proteins. Proteins also help to transport various things in the blood and across membranes, especially membranes that are not easily crossed over. And then also proteins are a major component of hormones, and hormones help to regulate lots of biological processes. Some of these hormones are insulin, growth hormone, cortisol. These hormones are largely responsible for our feelings and our moods and emotions. And so if we have low protein intakes, we are more likely to have imbalanced emotional status and imbalanced emotional responses. Certain things are able to cross over cell membranes very easily, but there are some things that our cell may either need to get in or to take out that will not easily transport over. And in these cases, when something needs to get in that can't easily get in, that's when proteins come into play. They're going to actually cause that thing to go from one side of the cell membrane to the other to either get in the cell or get out of the cell. Protein is also linked to fluid balance. So what happens with blood is that it's pumping fluid throughout our body, And that entire time, there is some blood that's being released out of the blood vessels. And the protein that's on the outside of the blood vessels, what that does is it causes that fluid that leaks out to go right back in. Now, when we don't have enough protein in our diet, that fluid is going to leak out and it's going to stay out and it's going to cause swelling. And that could be in our lower extremities. It could also be something that you see in the cases of many of the children who are in Africa who are starving, who have very thin legs, thin arms, a very emaciated appearance, but then their stomach is very enlarged and swollen. That swollen stomach is directly due to an inadequate amount of protein. And those people, they might get adequate total calories, but it's probably through something like rice, which is very low in protein. So they're going to have a large release of fluid into a certain area of their body. It gets that swelling that we're talking about that protein can prevent. We talked about protein as an energy source. The reason that it's so bad for us to use protein as energy is that it requires breakdown of our own body protein stores. And doing that is going to release a lot of urea, which is very acidic, which can lower our body pH, which is something that's very, very dangerous, potentially very harmful. We can create movement and power and force by having a large amount of muscle protein. However, we don't actually use the protein that's in our muscles for energy. What we do with that protein is we're able to store a very large amount of ATP, and ATP is actually what converts directly into energy. So it's the ATP in our muscles, which can be held in very large quantities in larger muscles, that is able to create force, but not the actual protein itself. Now, when we do use protein for energy, we use it when we're not getting adequate amounts of carbohydrates or fat. So the most common time that we're going to be breaking down protein is going to be when our diet's imbalanced, but after that, it's going to be in periods of starvation. And that is going to require, again, the breakdown of our own body tissue. Our body tissue is very important and it should not be broken down if at all possible, especially to be used for energy. One thing that happens is we initially are going to use things like our muscle, like our skeletal muscle, like our biceps, our triceps, quadriceps, calf muscles. But after that, our internal organs are going to be broken down as well. Our stomach is one of the first things to start breaking down to feed our body. And so what you see in early stages of starvation is that there's diarrhea that's going on because our body is not able to it's not able to have a fully functioning GI tract, so food isn't able to pass through it quite as effectively. It's not broken down all the way, so we get diarrhea. In very later stages of starvation, you're going to see more essential organs being broken down, things like the brain and even the heart. This next section is going to take a look at what happens when we have either too much or too little protein. Protein is muscle tissue, and if we do not have enough protein, then our muscle tissue is going to start to break down. Very severe examples of protein energy malnutrition, which you may see not too often in the United States, but with some higher frequency in third world countries, is kwashiorkor and marasmus. Marasmus means overall calorie and protein deficiency. It's the picture more so what you see on the left under normal, except everything is thinner. With kwashiorkor, most things are going to be normal, maybe some wasting, but you're going to have that extended abdomen because you're getting maybe enough calories, but you're getting inadequate amounts of protein. And so the blood is going to, the fluid from the blood is going to leak out of the blood vessels and escape into the abdomen, and you're going to see some swelling in that area. Unfortunately, extra protein does not convert into extra muscle. All that it does is once we reach the amount of protein that our body needs, anything beyond that is just converted right into body fat. Very disappointing. So how do we figure out how much protein we need? Well, this next chapter is going to look at how we figure that out. For protein, we're always going to be taking some in, and we're always going to be breaking some down. Now, ideally, we want to be in a state of balance where the amount in is meeting the amount of breakdown so that we're able to maintain the appropriate muscle tissue, or even in some cases, build more muscle tissue. In that case, we'd want to get into a positive protein balance. But there's always that balance to consider. And we look at that through something that's called nitrogen balance. And the reason we use the term nitrogen balance is because nitrogen is unique to protein. It's how we can measure the amount of protein that is coming in versus going out in our body. So nitrogen balance is directly related to protein balance. Now we're in a state of nitrogen balance, of optimal balance, whenever the amount of protein that we eat meets our needs. We're in a negative state of nitrogen balance when we're breaking down muscle tissue. So people who do a lot of heavy exercise and then do not eat protein afterwards, or somebody that has a very severe accident where they're exposed to some type of trauma and they have a lot of tissue and organ damage, and they're not able to replace the amount of protein that they're breaking down because they're breaking down such high amounts, they're in negative nitrogen balance. Somebody who's in positive nitrogen balance is somebody who's taking in more protein and hanging on to more protein than what they're losing. And this could be somebody that's working out a lot, but then eating adequate amounts of protein to rebuild and get more muscle tissue. Another good example of this is a pregnant woman who is adding tissue to her body in order to create a new baby. To determine the amount of protein that a person needs, there's a lot of factors that are going to go into that equation. The amount that they exercise, certainly. The amount of muscle tissue that they have is an important factor, but also the stage of life that they're at. It's very important. So when you're young, you're doing a lot of growing, and so your body needs a lot of protein because you're adding a lot of tissue to it, and the protein is what's going to actually form that tissue. So the amount of protein that a baby needs is pretty high, at least compared to their weight. The amount of protein that adult needs is relatively low compared to their weight. Now, an adult is going to need more total protein than a baby, but the baby's relative protein requirements compared to its weight are much higher. So, as an example, let's say that a baby, you're trying to figure out the amount of protein that a normal baby is going to need per day. Let's say that baby weighs 12 pounds. Well, first of all of these factors, they are in kilograms. So what you would do is you would first determine baby's weight in kilograms. So take 12, divide that by 2.2, and I believe that's going to give you 5. I think that's correct. So 5 times that factor, 5 times 1.52 is going to be around 7.5. So let's say 7.7, something like that. Around 7.5 grams of protein per day. So a high amount compared to their weight, 1.52, but 7.5 grams of protein, really not that much. Say you compare that to a relatively small adult, an adult that weighs 100 pounds. They are going to have a weight in kilograms of 45 kilograms. And then you would take
that 45 number in kilograms and multiply that by 0.8, and that's going to give you something around 35 grams of protein. So a relatively small amount in comparison, but let's say that that adult had the same protein requirement as that baby. If you took 45 times 1.5, that's going to give you something around 65 to 70 grams of protein. So you need a lot of protein as a young child or baby or even as a teenager. And this comparative amount of protein goes down as you age. And that's because there's a lot of growth that occurs when you're younger. The standard adult over the age of 19 years old is going to require about 0.8 grams per kilogram of protein per day. If you look at the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, that provides a pretty wide number for percentage of calories that should be coming from protein. That's 10 to 35%. I think generally it's best to go off that 0.8 grams per kilogram, or factors that we'll discuss on that next set of slides if you are active or have special lifestyle considerations or special life events going on. Needs are increased for younger kids and infants, women during pregnancy and lactation, after injury or trauma, and sometimes during illness, and also for people who are very active or athletes. Protein factors for infants are much higher. Again, that's 1.52 in the first 6 months and then 1.5 from months 6 through 12. Women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, they need an extra 25 grams of protein per day. If you have some type of trauma or injury, you're going to need a similar amount of protein to an athlete, generally from 1.2 to 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram. But for somebody that has very, very severe burns, as in a good part of their body was caught in a fire, this might go up to around 2.5 grams of protein per kilogram. And then athletes, again, 1.2 to 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram. The more active you are, and the more that your exercise relies on a greater amount of muscle tissue, then the closer that's going to be to that 2.0 range. And rarely does it get over that. Maybe people that are very, very active, um, maybe some collegiate athletes or Olympic level athletes might need more protein than that. But generally, most people do not need more than 2 grams per kilogram of protein per day. And that is less than 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, just as a reference. For this final section on proteins, we're going to take a look at foods that contain protein, and we're also going to break down the differences between vegetarian and meat or animal-based protein foods. First, let's take a look at animal-based protein foods. What you'll notice is that animal-based protein foods have a lot of protein. So if you were to take a 3-ounce serving of meat or poultry or fish, that 3-ounce serving, which is about the size of a deck of cards or about the palm of your hand, that's going to provide 20 grams of protein when that's cooked. And then other animal-based foods like dairy products or eggs. 1 egg has 7 grams of protein. 1 8-ounce glass of milk has 8 grams of protein. So anything that is derived from or directly an animal source of food, that's going to have a relatively high amount of protein. Next, we have plant-based proteins. And I've been a vegetarian before, and people have given me a hard time about that. And a lot of that has to do with protein intake. And they've always said, how do you get your protein? Well, the thing is, There's lots of sources, food sources that are vegetarian that do have decent amounts of protein, but the amount of protein that those vegetarian proteins have is going to be a lot lower than animal-based proteins. Like with animal-based proteins, generally, you're getting just protein, maybe some fat, but if you're getting a lean protein, that kind of takes care of that. It's just basically protein. But with plant-based proteins, a lot of times you're getting a good amount of carbohydrates. And then the amount of protein that comes with it is a little bit lower. So vegetarians have to be very careful with protein intake because of that. A half cup of beans is going to have 6 to 10 grams of protein. A slice of bread, 2 to 3 grams of protein. Whole grain bread will have a little bit more. A quarter cup of nuts or seeds is going to have 5 to 10 grams of protein. And a half cup of rice, cereal, pasta, that's going to have about 2 to 3 grams of protein. But now with that, with beans, you're going to get a good amount of carbs. Same with bread. With nuts or seeds, you'll get some carbs, but then you're also going to get a lot of fat. Nuts or seeds are primarily fat. And then with rice, pasta, or cereal, you're getting a lot of carbohydrates. So a lot of other macronutrients and sources of calories are going to come with these protein foods from the vegetarian sources. To clarify, animal-based protein foods, that's meat or fish or animal products. So we have beef, pork, poultry, fish, whether that be standard fish or shellfish, dairy, such as milk, yogurt, cheese, and eggs. And then plant-based sources of proteins, we have nuts and seeds, nut butters, beans and lentils, tofu, and whole grains. For this chart here, you have the diets of 4 different people, and of all the nutrients that they consume, we're just going to take a look at the animal protein and their saturated fat intake. Now, the blue line or the blue bar that represents animal protein, and the yellow bar represents the amount of saturated fat in the diet. Now, is there any correlation that you notice here? Well, it's not rocket science. As the amount of animal protein goes up, so does the amount of saturated fat. So animal protein is generally considered a higher source of saturated fat. And this has some health implications, but we'll kind of clarify this over the next slide or two. Research changes. That's a great thing about science. And nutrition research seems to change really, really quickly. What we used to know about, or what we used to think about saturated fat is that it's really, really bad for us. It doesn't have a lot of health benefits. But as the research has looked deeper into saturated fat, what we found is that saturated fat might not be great for us, at least in very large amounts, but in moderate amounts, it's not terrible. And it actually might have some health benefits. So saturated fat is linked to working as a signaling messenger for hormone production in the body. Cell membranes need some saturated fat for optimal structure and to function properly. Saturated fats protect the liver. The heart runs off saturated fat to pump blood. Saturated fats play a role in immunity. And bones need saturated fat in order to absorb and assimilate calcium effectively. And we'll cover this later in this course, but calcium is a major structural component of our bones. And then saturated fats also tell us that we're full and they help to control our appetite. So saturated fats, there is some link to higher cholesterol, some negative health outcomes, but at the same time, there are some positive benefits to it. So while we should probably somewhat limit it, we should not completely restrict it either. To understand this next concept, protein quality, you have to understand the concept of essential versus non-essential amino acids. Unfortunately, we've already covered that in this lecture, but let's just recap really quick. First of all, amino acids are the basic structure of proteins. Whether or not they are essential, that depends on whether or not the body makes them. So the non-essential ones are not essential because our body already makes those. The essential ones, our body needs to have those consumed through food, and that's why they are considered essential. So high quality proteins, these have all of the essential amino acids in them, and incomplete proteins do not. They're missing one or more of these essential amino acids. And primarily, we're going to get high quality proteins or these complete proteins from animal-based foods. We also get them from soy-based foods, but primarily from animal-based foods. So meat, poultry, fish, eggs, dairy, all those foods are high quality proteins. Now, the incomplete proteins, these are primarily from plant-based sources, and this includes things like beans, nuts, seeds, whole grains, etc. Now, this begs the question, should we be consuming complementary proteins if we're primarily consuming incomplete ones? So that would mean mixing proteins that are high in different essential amino acids. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. So let's look at three of the essential amino acids, one methionine, two cysteine, three lysine. If we were to get beans by themselves, beans would have a lot of lysine, but they would not have a lot of methionine or cysteine. However, fortunately, rice, which goes very well with beans, that has a lot of methionine and cysteine, but not much lysine. So if you were to combine these two together, then you get all the essential amino acids, and you are basically getting a complete protein. And this is great. However, the most recent research shows that as long as you get, if you primarily eat incomplete proteins, or if you're vegetarian or vegan, if you eat a variety of protein sources throughout the day, your body is going to figure it out. So you don't have to meticulously plan each meal to have specific complementary proteins. As long as you're getting a good variety of vegetarian proteins throughout the day, you should be fine. If your diet is very restricted or limited, then this would be a great concept to look into. But complementing proteins, not as necessary as we once thought. Now, this brings us to our next topic, vegetarian diets. And there are a few different types of vegetarians. We have pescatarian. That is somebody that excludes all animal products except for fish. So typically they would include dairy and eggs. Lacto and ovo-vegetarian. They include eggs and dairy products. Lacto, that includes lactose, so dairy like milk, cheese, yogurt. Ovo is eggs. Lacto-vegetarian includes dairy products. And then vegan, that's a strict vegetarian diet. That is only plant-based foods. No animal-based foods are allowed on that type of eating pattern. And some people will go so far as to avoid things like honey, because those come from bees, um, or even certain types of beers because of how they're processed. Not even necessarily because of the ingredients that they have, but because of what those ingredients might go through during the processing phase. So let's take a look at benefits of versus risks for a vegetarian versus animal-based diet. Vegetarian diets, they tend to be healthier, low-cost alternatives to traditional American diets if done correctly. I've seen many people who are vegetarian or vegan exclude animal products, but still put their meals together in a way that minimizes variety and also incorporates very high amounts of carbohydrates, salt, and sodium. There's also correlations with the vegetarian diet and lower body weight and also reduced risk of chronic disease. And again, just like that first bullet point, these benefits only occur if the diet is done correctly. Now, some risks, if you're not careful on a vegetarian diet, include increased risk of protein deficiency, vitamin B12, especially for vegans, calcium and vitamin D deficiency, deficiencies in iron and zinc, and also an inadequate intake of omega-3 fatty acids. Now, all of these things, all of these nutrients, we can get enough of them on a vegetarian and even a vegan diet. For vitamin B12, if we're vegan, we probably have to supplement that. But we can probably get all of those nutrients as long as we are carefully planning and incorporating the correct foods into our eating plan.